Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg, German, listen, Polish, Rosa Luxemburg, also Rozalia Luxenburg, March 5, 1871, January 15, 1919, was a Polish Marxist theorist, philosopher, economist, anti-war activist and revolutionary socialist who became a naturalized German citizen at the age of 28. Successively, she was a member of the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, SDKPiL, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, the Independent Social Democratic Party, USPD, and the Communist Party of Germany, KPD. After the SPD supported German involvement in World War I in 1915, Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht co-founded the anti-war Spartacus League, Spartacusbund, which eventually became the KPD. During the November Revolution, she co-founded the newspaper Die Rote Fahne, the Red Flag, the central organ of the Spartacist movement. Luxemburg considered the Spartacist uprising of January 1919 a blunder, but supported the attempted overthrow of the government and rejected any attempt at a negotiated solution. Friedrich Ebert's majority SPD government crushed the revolt and the Spartacusbund by sending in the Freikorps, government-sponsored paramilitary groups consisting mostly of World War I veterans. Freikorps troops captured and summarily executed Luxemburg and Liebknecht during the rebellion. Luxemburg's body was thrown in the Landwehr Canal in Berlin. Due to her pointed criticism of both the Leninist and the more moderate social democratic schools of socialism, Luxemburg has had a somewhat ambivalent reception among scholars and theorists of the political left. Nonetheless, Luxemburg and Liebknecht were extensively idolized as communist martyrs by the East German communist regime. The German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution notes that idolization of Luxemburg and Liebknecht is an important tradition of German far-left extremism. Life. Poland. Luxemburg was born on March 5, 1871 in Zamość. The Luxemburg family were Polish Jews living in Russian-controlled Poland. She was the fifth and youngest child of timber trader Elias Luxemburg in Lein-Löwenstein. Luxemburg later stated that her father imparted an interest in liberal ideas in her while her mother was religious and well-read with books kept at home. The family spoke Polish and German, and Luxemburg also learned Russian. The family moved to Warsaw in 1873. After being bedridden with a hip ailment at the age of 5, she was left with a permanent limp. In 1884, she enrolled at a gymnasium, all-girls secondary school, in Warsaw which she attended until 1887. The Zweite Gymnasium was a school that only rarely accepted Polish applicants and acceptance of Jewish children was even more exceptional. The children were only permitted to speak Russian. From 1886, Luxemburg belonged to the Polish left-wing Proletariat Party, founded in 1882, anticipating the Russian parties by 20 years. She began political activities by organizing a general strike. As a result, 4 of the Proletariat Party leaders were put to death and the party was disbanded, though the remaining members, including Luxemburg, kept meeting in secret. In 1887, she passed her Matura, secondary school graduation, examinations. After fleeing to Switzerland to escape detention in 1889, she attended the University of Zurich, as did the socialists Anatoly Lunacharsky and Leo Dziadzicz, where she studied philosophy, history, politics, economics, and mathematics. She specialized in Staatswissenschaft, government science, economic and stock exchange crises, and the Middle Ages. Her doctoral dissertation The Industrial Development of Poland, Die Industrielle Entwicklung Polens, was officially presented in the spring of 1897 at the University of Zurich, which awarded her a Doctor of Law degree. Her dissertation was published by Duncker and Humblot in Leipzig in 1898. She was an oddity in Zurich as she was one of the very few women with a doctorate. She plunged immediately into the politics of international Marxism, following in the footsteps of Georgy Plehunov and Pavel Axelrod. In 1893, with Leo Dziadzicz and Julian Marchlewski, alias Julius Karski, Luxemburg founded the newspaper Sprawa Robotniks, the workers' cause, which opposed the nationalist policies of the Polish Socialist Party. Luxemburg believed that an independent Poland could arise and exist only through socialist revolutions in Germany, Austria-Hungary and Russia. She maintained that the struggle should be against capitalism, not just for Polish independence. Her position of denying a national right of self-determination under socialism provoked a philosophic disagreement with Vladimir Lenin. She and Leo Dziadzicz co-founded the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, SDKPiL, party, after merging Congress Poland's and Lithuania's social democratic organizations. Despite living in Germany for most of her adult life, Luxemburg was the principal theoretician of the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland, SDKP, later the SDKPiL, and led the party in a partnership with József, its principal organizer. Germany. Luxemburg wanted to move to Germany to be at the center of the party struggle, but she had no way of obtaining permission to remain there indefinitely. In April 1897 she married the son of an old friend, Gustav Lübeck, in order to gain a German citizenship. They never lived together and they formally divorced 5 years later. She returned briefly to Paris, then moved permanently to Berlin to begin her fight for Edward Bernstein's constitutional reform movement. Luxemburg hated the stifling conservatism of Berlin. She despised Prussian men and resented what she saw as the grip of urban capitalism on social democracy. In the Social Democratic Party of Germany's women's section, she met Clara Zetkin, of whom she made a lifelong friend. Between 1907 and his conscription in 1915, she was involved in a love affair with Clara's younger son, Kostya Zetkin, to which approximately 600 surviving letters, now mostly published, bear testimony. Luxemburg was a member of the uncompromising left wing of the SPD. Their clear position was that the objectives of liberation for the industrial working class and all minorities could be achieved by revolution only. The recently published letters of Rosa Luxemburg shed important light on her life in Germany. As Irene Gamel writes in a review of the English translation of the book in the Globe and Mail, the 3 decades covered by the 230 letters in this collection provide the context for her major contributions as a political activist, socialist theorist and writer. Her reputation was tarnished by Joseph Stalin's cynicism in questions concerning the history of Bolshevism. In his rewriting of Russian events, he placed the blame for the theory of permanent revolution on Luxemburg's shoulders, with faint praise for her attacks on Karl Kautsky which she commenced in 1910. According to Gamel, in her controversial tome of 1913, The Accumulation of Capital, as well as through her work as a co-founder of the radical Spartacus League, Luxemburg helped to shape Germany's young democracy by advancing an international, rather than a nationalist, outlook. This farsightedness partly explains her remarkable popularity as a socialist icon and its continued resonance in movies, novels and memorials dedicated to her life and oeuvre. Gamel also notes that for Luxemburg the revolution was a way of life and yet that the letters also challenged the stereotype of Red Rosa as a ruthless fighter. However, the accumulation of capital sparked angry accusations from the Communist Party of Germany. In 1923, Ruth Fisher and Arkady Maslow denounced the work as errors, a derivative work of economic miscalculation known as spontaneity. Before World War I. When Luxemburg moved to Germany in May 1898, she settled in Berlin. She was active there in the left wing of the SPD, in which she sharply defined the border between the views of her faction and the revisionism theory of Edward Bernstein. She attacked him in her brochure Social Reform or Revolution? Released in September 1898. Luxemburg's rhetorical skill made her a leading spokesperson in denouncing the SPD's reformist parliamentary course. She argued that the critical difference between capital and labor could only be countered if the proletariat assumed power and effected revolutionary changes in methods of production. She wanted the revisionists ousted from the SPD. That did not occur, but Kautsky's leadership retained a Marxist influence on its program. From 1900, Luxemburg published analyses of contemporary European socio-economic problems in newspapers. Foreseeing war, she vigorously attacked what she saw as German militarism and imperialism. Luxemburg wanted a general strike to rouse the workers to solidarity and prevent the coming war. However, the SPD leaders refused and she broke with Kautsky in 1910. Between 1904 and 1906, she was imprisoned for her political activities on 3 occasions. In 1907, she went to the Russian Social Democrats' Fifth Party Day in London, where she met Vladimir Lenin. At the Socialist Second International Congress in Stuttgart, her resolution demanding that all European workers' parties should unite in attempting to stop the war was accepted. Luxemburg taught Marxism and economics at the SPD's Berlin Training Center. Her former student Friedrich Ebert became the SPD leader and later the Weimar Republic's first president. In 1912, Luxemburg was the SPD representative at the European Socialist Congresses. With French socialist Jean Jaurès, Luxemburg argued that European workers' parties should organize a general strike when war broke out. In 1913, she told a large meeting, "If they think we are going to lift the weapons of murder against our French and other brethren, then we shall shout, we will not do it." However, when nationalist crises in the Balkans erupted to violence and then war in 1914, there was no general strike and the SPD majority supported the war, as did the French socialists. The Reichstag unanimously agreed to financing the war. The SPD voted in favor of that and agreed to a truce, Bergfrieden, with the imperial government, promising to refrain from any strikes during the war. This led Luxemburg to contemplate suicide as the revisionism she had fought since 1899 had triumphed. In response, Luxemburg organized anti-war demonstrations in Frankfurt, calling for conscientious objection to military conscription and the refusal to obey orders. On that account, she was imprisoned for a year for inciting to disobedience against the authorities' law and order. Shortly after her death, her fame was alluded to by Gregory Zinoviev at the Petrograd Soviet on January 18, 1919, as he adjudged her astute assessment of Bolshevism. During the war. In August 1914, Luxemburg, along with Karl Liebknecht, Claire Zetkin, and Franz Mehring, founded the Die Internationale, the International, group which became the Spartacus League in January 1916. They wrote a legal anti-war pamphlet pseudonymously signed Spartacus after the slave-liberating Thracian gladiator who opposed the Romans. Luxemburg's pseudonym was Junius, after Lucius Junius Brutus, founder of the Roman Republic. The Spartacus League vehemently rejected the SPD's support in the Reichstag for funding the war, and sought to lead Germany's proletariat towards an anti-war general strike. As a result, Luxemburg and Liebknecht were imprisoned in June 1916 for 2.5 years. During imprisonment, Luxemburg was twice relocated, first to Posen, now Poznan, then to Breslau, now Wrocław. Friends smuggled out and illegally published her articles. Among them was the Russian Revolution, criticizing the Bolsheviks, presciently warning of their dictatorship. Nonetheless, she continued to call for a dictatorship of the proletariat, albeit not of the one-party Bolshevik model. In that context, she wrote the words Freiheit ist immer die Freiheit des anderen Kinden, freedom is always the freedom of the one who thinks differently, and continues in the same chapter, the public life of countries with limited freedom is so poverty-stricken, so miserable, so rigid, so unfruitful, precisely because, through the exclusion of democracy, it cuts off the living sources of all spiritual riches and progress. Another article written in April 1915 when in prison and published and distributed illegally in June 1916 originally under the pseudonym Junius was Die Krise der Sozialdemokratie, The Crisis of Social Democracy, also known as the Junius Brochure or the Junius Pamphlet. In 1917, the Spartacus League was affiliated with the Independent Social Democratic Party, USPD, founded by Hugo Huss and made up of anti-war former SPD members. In November 1918, the USPD and the SPD assumed power in the new republic upon the abdication of Emperor Wilhelm II. This followed the German Revolution that began with the Kiel Mutiny, when workers' and soldiers' councils seized most of Germany to put an end to World War I and to the monarchy. The USPD and most of the SPD members supported the councils while the SPD leaders feared this could lead to a Räterepublik, Council Republic, like the Soviets of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. Luxemburg was freed from prison in Breslau on November 8, 1918, 3 days before the armistice of November 11, 1918. 1 day later, Karl Liebknecht, who had also been freed from prison, proclaimed the Free Socialist Republic, Freie Sozialistische Republik, in Berlin. He and Luxemburg reorganized the Spartacus League and founded the Red Flag, Die Rotfahne, newspaper, demanding amnesty for all political prisoners and the abolition of capital punishment in the Essay Against Capital Punishment. On December 14, 1918, they published the new program of the Spartacus League. From 29 to December 31, 1918, they took part in a joint congress of the League, Independent Socialists and the International Communists of Germany, IKD, that led to the foundation on January 1, 1919 of the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, under the leadership of Liebknecht and Luxemburg. Luxemburg supported the new KPD's participation in the Weimar National Assembly that founded the Weimar Republic, but she was outvoted and the KPD boycotted the elections. In January 1919, a second revolutionary wave swept Berlin. On New Year's Day, Luxemburg declared. Like Liebknecht, Luxemburg supported the violent putsch attempt. The red flag encouraged the rebels to occupy the editorial offices of the liberal press and later, all positions of power. On 8 January, Luxemburg's red flag printed a public statement by her, in which she called for revolutionary violence and no negotiations with the revolution's mortal enemies, the Friedrich Ebert Philipp Scheidemann government. In response to the uprising, German Chancellor and SPD leader Friedrich Ebert ordered the Freikorps to destroy the left-wing revolution, which was crushed by January 11, 1919. Luxemburg's red flag falsely claimed that the rebellion was spreading across Germany. On 10 January, Luxemburg called for the murder of Scheidemann's supporters and said they had earned their fate. The uprising was small-scale, had limited support and consisted of the occupation of a few newspaper buildings and the construction of street barricades. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were captured in Berlin on January 15, 1919 by the Rifled Division of the Cavalry Guards of the Freikorps, Guard Cavalry Schützen Division. Its commander Captain Waldemar Pabst, with Lieutenant Horst von Pflug-Hartung, questioned them under torture and then gave the order to summarily execute them. Luxemburg was knocked down with a rifle butt by the soldier Otto Runge, then shot in the head, either by Lieutenant Kurt Vogel or by Lieutenant Hermann Souchon. Her body was flung into Berlin's Landwehr Canal. In the Tiergarten, Liebknecht was shot in his body, without a name, brought to a morgue. The execution of Luxemburg and Liebknecht inspired a new wave of violence in Berlin and across Germany. Thousands of members of the KPD as well as other revolutionaries and civilians were killed. Finally, the People's Navy Division, Volksmarine Division, and Workers' and Soldiers' Councils which had moved to the political left disbanded. Luxemburg was held in high regard by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, who recognized her revolutionary credentials at the Third International. The last part of the German Revolution saw many instances of armed violence and strikes throughout Germany. Significant strikes occurred in Berlin, the Bremen Soviet Republic, Saxony, Saxe-Gotha, Hamburg, the Rhinelands and the Ruhr region. Last to strike was the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which was suppressed on May 2, 1919. More than 4 months after the execution of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, on June 1, 1919, Luxemburg's corpse was found and identified after an autopsy at the Charité Hospital in Berlin. Otto Runge was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for attempted manslaughter, and Lieutenant Vogel to 4 months for failing to report a corpse. However, Vogel escaped after a brief custody. Pabst and Souchon went unpunished. The Nazis later compensated Runge for having been jailed. He died in Berlin in Soviet custody after the end of World War II, and they merged the Guard Cavalry Schützen Division into the SA. In an interview with German news magazine Der Spiegel in 1962 and again in his memoirs, Pabst maintained that 2 leaders of the SPD, Defense Minister Gustav Noske and Chancellor Friedrich Ebert, had approved of his actions. His account has been neither confirmed nor denied since the case has not been examined by Parliament or the courts. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were buried at the Friedrichsfelde Central Cemetery in Berlin, where socialists and communists commemorate them yearly on the second Sunday of January. Thought. Luxemburg defended Karl Marx's dialectical materialism and conception of history. Karl Kautsky, the ethical socialist, rejected neo-Kantian arguments in favor of social Darwinism. The proletariat had to be reorganized in 1893 and in 1910 to 1911 as a precondition before they could act. These formed the substantive form of arguments with Luxemburg in 1911, when the two seriously fell out. Like Luxemburg, Kautsky saw that what was true for the radicals Vladimir Lenin and Alexander Parvus in Russia was not necessarily so true in Germany. Kautsky was older than Luxemburg, more cautious and read mass strikes as adventurism. However, radical qualitative change for the working class would lead Luxemburg into an age of revolution which she thought had arrived. She was determined to push capitalism to its limits to develop class consciousness. In order to get organization and consciousness, workers had to strike to test resilience to exploitation, but this would not be achievable through blind adherence to party organization. Revolutionary socialist democracy. Luxemburg professed a commitment to democracy and the necessity of revolution. Luxemburg's idea of democracy, which Stanley Aronowitz calls generalized democracy in an unarticulated form, represents Luxemburg's greatest break with mainstream communism, since it effectively diminishes the role of the Communist Party, but it is in fact very similar to the views of Karl Marx. The emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. According to Aronowitz, the vagueness of Luxemburgian democracy is one reason for its initial difficulty in gaining widespread support. Luxemburg herself clarified her position on democracy in her writings regarding the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. Early on, Luxemburg attacked undemocratic tendencies present in the Russian Revolution. Luxemburg also insisted on socialist democracy. Opposition to imperialist war and capitalism. While being critical of the politics of the Bolsheviks, Luxemburg saw the behavior of the Social Democratic Second International as a complete betrayal of socialism. As she saw it at the outset of the First World War, the social democratic parties around the world betrayed the world's working class by supporting their own individual bourgeoisies in the war. This included her own Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, the majority of whose delegates in the Reichstag voted for war credits. Luxemburg opposed the sending of the working class youth of each country to what she viewed as slaughter in a war over which of the national bourgeoisies would control world resources and markets. She broke from the Second International, viewing it as nothing more than an opportunist party that was doing administrative work for the capitalists. Along with Karl Liebknecht, Luxemburg organized a strong movement in Germany with these views, but she was imprisoned and after her release killed for her work during the failed German Revolution of 1919, a revolution which the SPD violently opposed. The accumulation of capital. The accumulation of capital was the only work Luxemburg published on economics during her lifetime. In the polemic, she argued that capitalism needs to constantly expand into non-capitalist areas in order to access new supply sources, markets for surplus value and reservoirs of labor. According to Luxemburg, Marx had made an error in Das Kapital in that the proletariat could not afford to buy the commodities they produced, and by his own criteria it was impossible for capitalists to make a profit in a closed capitalist system since the demand for commodities would be too low and therefore much of the value of commodities could not be transformed into money. According to Luxemburg, capitalists sought to realize profits through offloading surplus commodities onto non-capitalist economies, hence the phenomenon of imperialism as capitalist states sought to dominate weaker economies. However, this was leading to the destruction of non-capitalist economies as they were increasingly absorbed into the capitalist system. With the destruction of non-capitalist economies, there would be no more markets to offload surplus commodities onto and capitalism would break down. The accumulation of capital was harshly criticized by both Marxist and non-Marxist economists on the grounds that her logic was circular in proclaiming the impossibility of realizing profits in a closed capitalist system and that her underconsumptionist theory was too crude. Her conclusion that the limits of the capitalist system drive it to imperialism and war led Luxemburg to a lifetime of campaigning against militarism and colonialism. Dialectic of spontaneity and organization. The dialectic of spontaneity and organization was the central feature of Luxemburg's political philosophy, wherein spontaneity is a grassroots approach to organizing a party-oriented class struggle. She argued that spontaneity and organization are not separable or separate activities, but different moments of one political process, as one does not exist without the other. These beliefs arose from her view that class struggle evolves from an elementary, spontaneous state to a higher level. Luxemburg did not hold spontaneism as an abstraction, but she developed the dialectic of spontaneity and organization under the influence of mass strikes in Europe, especially the Russian Revolution of 1905. Unlike the social democratic orthodoxy of the Second International, she did not regard organization as a product of scientific theoretic insight to historical imperatives, but as product of the working class's struggles. Luxemburg also argued criticism of the October Revolution. In an article published just before the October Revolution, Luxemburg characterized the Russian February Revolution of 1917 as a revolution of the proletariat and said that the liberal bourgeoisie were pushed to movement by the display of proletarian power. The task of the Russian proletariat, she said, was now to end the imperialist world war in addition to struggling against the imperialist bourgeoisie. The world war made Russia ripe for a socialist revolution. Therefore, the German proletariat are also posed a question of honor, and a very fateful question. In several works, including an essay written from jail and published posthumously by her last companion Paul Levi, publication of which precipitated his expulsion from the Third International, titled The Russian Revolution, Luxemburg sharply criticized some Bolshevik policies such as their suppression of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918 and their policy of supporting the purported right of all national peoples to self-determination. According to Luxemburg, the Bolsheviks' strategic mistakes created tremendous dangers for the revolution, such as its bureaucratization. Her sharp criticism of the October Revolution and the Bolsheviks was lessened insofar as she compared the errors of the revolution and of the Bolsheviks with the complete failure of the international proletariat. Bolshevik theorists such as Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky responded to this criticism by arguing that Luxemburg's notions were classical Marxist ones, but they could not be applied to Russia of 1917. They stated that the lessons of actual experience such as the confrontation with the bourgeois parties had forced them to revise the Marxian strategy. As part of this argument, it was pointed out that after Luxemburg herself got out of jail, she was also forced to confront the National Assembly in Germany, a step they compared with their own conflict with the Russian Constituent Assembly. After the October Revolution, it becomes the historic responsibility of the German workers to carry out a revolution for themselves and thereby end the war. When the German Revolution also broke out, Luxemburg immediately began agitating for a social revolution. In her later work The Russian Tragedy, Luxemburg blamed many of the perceived failures of the Bolsheviks on the lack of a socialist uprising in Germany. Luxemburg further stated, Luxemburg also considered a socialist uprising in Germany to be the solution to the problems the Bolsheviks faced. Epitaph on her death. Despite the criticism, Lenin praised Luxemburg after her death as an eagle of the working class. Trotsky also publicly mourned Luxemburg's death. In later years, Trotsky frequently defended Luxemburg, claiming that Joseph Stalin had vilified her. In the article Hands Off Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky criticized Stalin for this despite what Trotsky perceived as Luxemburg's theoretical errors, writing, "Yes, Stalin has sufficient cause to hate Rosa Luxemburg. But all the more imperious therefore becomes our duty to shield Rosa's memory from Stalin's calumny that has been caught by the hired functionaries of both hemispheres, and to pass on this truly beautiful, heroic, and tragic image to the young generations of the proletariat in all its grandeur and inspirational force." Quotations. Last words, belief in revolution. Luxemburg's last known words written on the evening of her murder were about her belief in the masses and what she saw as the inevitability of a triumphant revolution. Commemoration. The Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution notes that idolization of Luxemburg and Liebknecht is an important tradition of German far-left extremism. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were idolized as communist martyrs by the East German Communist regime and are still idolized by the East German Communist Party's successor party, the Left. In the former East Germany and East Berlin, various places were named for Luxemburg by the East German Communist Party. These include the Rosa Luxemburg Platz and a U-Bahn station which were located in East Berlin during the Cold War. The engraving on the nearby pavement reads Ich war, ich bin, ich werde sein, I was, I am, I will be. Dresden has a street and streetcar stop named after Luxemburg. The Volksbühne, People's Theater, is on Rosa Luxemburg Platz. The names remained unchanged after the German reunification. During the Polish People's Republic in Warsaw's Wola district, a manufacturing facility of electric lamps was established and named after Luxemburg. In 1919, Bertolt Brecht wrote the poetic memorial epitaph honoring Luxemburg, and Kurt Weill set it to music in the Berlin Requiem in 1928. The British New Left historian Isaac Deutsche wrote of Luxemburg, in her assassination Hohenzollern Germany celebrated its last triumph and Nazi Germany its first. Opponents of Marxism had a very different interpretation of Luxemburg's murder. Anti-communist Russian refugees occasionally expressed envy for the Freikorps' success in defeating the Spartacus League. In a 1922 conversation with Count Harry Kessler, one such refugee lamented, "There is also a monument in Luxembourg for Lady Rosa done by Sonia Ivkovic. In Barcelona, there are terraced gardens named in her honor. In Madrid, there is a street and several public schools and associations named after Luxemburg. Other Spanish cities including Gijón, Getafe or Arganda del Rey have streets named after her." At the edge of the Tiergarten on the Katharina Heimroth-Ufer, which runs between the southern bank of the Landwehr Canal and the bordering Zoologischer Garten, Zoological Garden, a memorial has been installed by a private initiative. On the memorial, the name Rosa Luxemburg appears in raised capital letters, marking the spot where her body was thrown into the canal by Freikorps troops. The famous monument to Rosa Luxemburg in Karl Liebknecht, originally named Monument to the November Revolution, Revolutionsdenkmal, which was built in 1926 in Berlin-Lichtenberg and destroyed in 1935, was designed by pioneering modernist and later Bauhaus director Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. The memorial took the form of a suprematist composition of brick masses. Van der Rohe said, As most of these people were shot in front of a brick wall would be what I would build as a monument. The commission came about through the offices of Edward Fuchs, who showed a proposal featuring Doric columns and medallions of Liebknecht and Luxemburg, prompting Mies' laughter and the comment that would be a good monument for a banker. The monument was destroyed by the Nazis after they took power. Two small international networks based on her political thought characterized themselves as Luxemburgists, namely the Communist Democracy, Luxemburgist, founded in 2005, and the International Luxemburgist Network, founded in 2008. Feminists and Trotskyists as well as leftists in Germany especially show interest in Luxemburg's ideas. Distinguished modern Marxist thinkers such as Ernest Mandel, who has even been characterized as Luxemburgist, have seen Luxemburg's thought as a corrective to revolutionary theory. In 2002, 10,000 people marched in Berlin for Luxemburg and Liebknecht, and another 90,000 people laid carnations on their graves. Annual demonstration. In the city of Berlin, a Liebknecht-Luxemburg demonstration, shortly LL Demo, is organized annually in the month of January around the date of their death. This demonstration takes place on the second weekend of the month in Berlin Friedrichshain, starting near the Frankfurter Tor to the central cemetery Friedrichsfelde, also known as the Gedenkstätte der Socialisten, Socialist Memorial. During the East Germany era, the event was said to be orchestrated as a mere show event for Socialist Unity Party of Germany celebrities, broadcast live on its state television. In January 2019, the German left-wing parties commemorated at the occasion of this demonstration the 100th anniversary of the murder on Luxemburg and Liebknecht. In popular culture and literature. Due to Luxemburg's importance in the development of theories of Marxist humanist thought, the role of democracy and mass action to achieve international socialism, as a pioneering feminist and as a martyr to her cause, she has become a minor iconic figure, celebrated with references in popular culture. Corpse identification controversy. On May 29, 2009, Spiegel Online, the internet branch of the news magazine Der Spiegel, reported the recently considered possibility that someone else's remains had mistakenly been identified as Luxemburg's and buried as hers. The forensic pathologist Michael Tsokos, head of the Institute of Legal Medicine and Forensic Sciences at the Berlin Charité, discovered a preserved corpse lacking head, feet, or hands in the cellar of the Charité's Medical History Museum. He found the corpse's autopsy report suspicious and decided to perform a CT scan on the remains. The body showed signs of having been waterlogged at some point, and the scans showed that it was the body of a woman of 40 to 50 years of age who suffered from osteoarthritis and had legs of differing length. At the time of her murder, Luxemburg was 47 years old and suffering from a congenital dislocation of the hip that caused her legs to have different lengths. A laboratory in Kiel also tested the corpse using radiocarbon dating techniques and confirmed that it dated from the same period as Luxemburg's murder. The original autopsy, performed on June 13, 1919 on the body that was eventually buried at Friedrichsfelde, showed certain inconsistencies that supported Tsokos' hypothesis. The autopsy explicitly noted an absence of hip damage and stated that there was no evidence that the legs were of different lengths. Additionally, the autopsy showed no traces on the upper skull of the two blows by rifle butt inflicted upon Luxemburg. Finally, while the 1919 examiners noted a hole in the corpse's head between left eye and ear, they did not find an exit wound or the presence of a bullet within the skull. Assistant pathologist Paul Frankel appeared to doubt at the time that the corpse he had examined was Luxemburg's, and in a signed addendum distanced himself from his colleagues' conclusions. This addendum and the inconsistencies between the autopsy report and the known facts persuaded Tsokos to examine the remains more closely. According to eyewitnesses, when Luxemburg's body was thrown into the canal, weights were wired to her ankles and wrists. These could have slowly severed her extremities in the months her corpse spent in the water, which would explain the missing hands and feet issue. Tsokos realized that DNA testing was the best way to confirm or deny the identity of the body as Luxemburg's. His team had initially hoped to find traces of the DNA on old postage stamps that Luxemburg had licked, but it transpired that Luxemburg had never done this, preferring to moisten stamps with a damp cloth. The examiners decided to look for a surviving blood relative, and in July 2009 the German Sunday newspaper Bild am Sonntag reported that a great-niece of Luxemburg had been located, a 79-year-old woman named Irene Bord. She donated strands of her hair for DNA comparison. In December 2009, Berlin authorities seized the corpse to perform an autopsy before burying it in Luxemburg's grave. The Berlin Public Prosecutor's Office announced in late December 2009 that while there were indications that the corpse was Luxemburg's, there was not enough evidence to provide conclusive proof. In particular, DNA extracted from the hair of Luxemburg's niece did not match that belonging to the cadaver. Socialist had earlier said that the chances of a match were only 40%. The remains were to be buried at an undisclosed location while testing was to continue on tissue samples. Ancestry. Works. Writings. This is a list of selected writings. Speeches. 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 A list of selected writings.